We now have the pleasure of being joined by Mike Carmin of the Lafayette Journal and Courier, coming on and helping us break down all things Purdue Boilermakers football related. Mike, how's it going today? Thanks so much for coming on.
Thanks for having me, and I assume that the momentum and buzz for this game continues to build each week in your fine city after the 2-0 start.
Well, this was a game that when Syracuse came out with its schedule so many months ago, a lot of people had circled on the calendar, and here we are now after a 2-0 start for the Cuse, and it just increases the stakes that much more. But Mike, let's start with Purdue. 2 weeks in, obviously, this past week was what it was, and, a full display of what this team is capable of when all things go according to plan. What's sort of been the synopsis for this team so far 2 weeks in?
Well, I don't think you should put a lot of stock into what happened last week. FCS team, first play of the game, they forced a fumble and got in the end zone 3 plays later, and they just overwhelmed them with their talent. So 56-0 wasn't a surprise. I'm not sure. A lot of players played, and that was the biggest takeaway. You really have to look at the Penn State game to try to get a gauge of where this team's at. They were able to put up 24 offensive points. They scored on a pick 6, but they bogged down in the fourth quarter. And I just think Purdue's going to play a lot of close games this year, starting Saturday or continuing on Saturday, and how they react and how they handle probably the same situation again, where they're either going to be ahead, they're going to be behind, and how do they manage that? They've had some injuries since then. Jalen Graham, their top defensive player, is out for at least 3 more weeks. And how does Purdue overcome that? He's a guy that you can line up anywhere on the field. He plays sideline to sideline. So Purdue's going to have some players step up to overcome his absence. And can Aidan O'Connell continue his high percentage, which history tells you yes, but they're going to need some other receivers to step up. So jury's still out a little bit on Purdue, how good they can be this year. A lot of optimism before the year. In some circles, potentially winning 10 games based on the schedule. But, in the offseason, Syracuse really wasn't an earmarked game because no one was really talking about Syracuse in the offseason. And not that Purdue was expected to go in there and win, but I think the circumstances have now changed where you see what Syracuse has done in the first 2 games, and it definitely has Purdue's attention. And this is, shaping up to be a really important game for both programs, for them to either go one way or the other here in September.
Absolutely. I want to go back to the Penn State game from week 1 that you mentioned a couple of moments ago. Both of these teams started with conference games in week 1, a bit unusual, and went in 2 different directions, Syracuse blowing out Louisville and the Boilermakers falling closely at home to Penn State. So what was that Penn State game like from a Purdue perspective? Was it more of like a learning experience? Were they expected to win that game even though it was at home, albeit against a Penn State team that has a history and a pedigree? What was that experience of having a conference home opener to start the season like?
Well, there was plenty of buzz for the game. Thursday night, national television, and you had a brand name like Penn State coming in. I don't know if, Purdue had lost 9 straight games to Penn State. They hadn't beaten them since 2004. And they still haven't beaten them since 2004. So they've lost 10 straight. Penn State was the favorite, but what that means really, doesn't matter. Purdue is at home. They had an opportunity to win the game. And at the end, they got the pick 6. They got the crowd into it. They had a couple offensive possessions that could have sealed up the game, and they didn't do it. Jeff Brohm really likes to have the offense on the field at the end of the game to wrap up the game. And they had 2 chances. They didn't do it. And that has kind of lingered with them. And the other thing that happened at the end of the first half, Penn State's up 14-10. There's 30 seconds to go. Penn State throws a long pass. The tight end breaks a gobs of tackles. Purdue tackles poorly, and they get in the end zone. It's 21-10, and the juice is sucked out of the building. But Purdue bounced back, couple good third quarter drives and got the lead, but they just need to be in a position again when they get in a close game to close it out. What will they do differently? Will they just execute better? Jeff Brohm, they've closed out games before through the air. The one criticism of that game is they didn't run the ball in the fourth quarter. They didn't eat enough time. They didn't force Penn State to use its timeouts. But will Jeff Brohm do the same thing, or will he, maybe try to run the ball a little bit? So there's a lot of lessons that can be learned from that game, but the next time they're in that situation, we'll see if they've actually learned those lessons.
Don't want to harp on this Penn State game too much because, obviously it's 2 weeks ago and we've spent some time discussing it here. But the last one I've got for you, because it's really, as you mentioned, where you can draw the most from on this team so far through 2 weeks. Fair to say going into week 3 here against the Cuse that it could be a very similar style game in terms of the game plan. Two teams in the orange and the Boilermakers that like to put up a lot of points and have really aired it out here through 2 weeks. Obviously, Syracuse getting it done on the ground with Sean Tucker as well. Could you see a sort of similar narrative that you had against the Nittany Lions 2 weeks ago?
Well, Purdue's going to throw the ball. That's what they do. That's their strength. Jeff Brohm wants to throw the ball. That's what he likes to do. And he has the quarterback to throw the ball. And he has the number one receiver to throw the ball to. They just have not had the number 2 receiver or another receiver step up. Now, part of that's on the quarterback getting others involved. But yeah, Purdue's going to throw the ball. It's what they do. I would expect 50 to 55 passes. They'll sprinkle in the run, and they've, the Penn State game, they didn't run the ball poorly, but they didn't get 100 yards, which is something they haven't done a whole lot. But they need to sprinkle it in to create some balance and do some different things. So Purdue's going to throw the ball. Syracuse is going to throw it, but also they probably have more weapons to run the ball effectively than Purdue does, and how Purdue's defense is going to be able to deal with both the quarterback Schrader and Tucker. And I know that they're focused on those two coming into this game.
We've talked about Jeff Brohm a little bit. I want to dive deeper into him. He's a football lifer, been around the game for a very long time. When you think of Big Ten football, Purdue probably isn't the first or even the 5th program that comes to mind. But, last year, the first 9-win season for the Boilermakers in almost 2 decades. How has he been able to be so successful out in West Lafayette?
As I mentioned, he throws the ball. Purdue's program evolves around the quarterback. It always has. It did before Jeff Brohm was here. You go back to, these names won't mean anything to you. Jack Mullenkoff, who took Purdue to its first Rose Bowl in the late 60s. Bob Greasy should be a familiar name to some people. He played at Purdue. He was the quarterback for the Dolphins. But Purdue's program has always been about the quarterback. And Jeff Brohm is a perfect fit for that because he's a former quarterback. He's about the quarterback, and that's what they do. And that's who they're always going to be. They're not a Wisconsin type of program or an Iowa type program where they get these big offensive linemen and they're going to run the ball down your throat. I like to say Purdue doesn't have the infrastructure for that. They just have never really recruited well in that area. They've had offensive linemen go to the NFL and all that kind of stuff, but they're not known for that. They're known for throwing the ball around the field, scoring points. And if you remember the Joe Tiller days at Purdue, that's what they did. And he was a perfect fit for Purdue when he came. Jeff Brohm's a perfect fit from that standpoint. And that's how Purdue has to win games. They have to win games through the air. They have to recruit good quarterbacks, and then try to fill it out with really talented receivers to be able to have those threats on the field. And over the years, they've had good defenses. A lot of guys that played defense at Purdue went on in the NFL. They've had a run of really good players in that area, but their defense has never been the thing that Purdue is known for. They're known for quarterback, known for scoring points, putting the ball in the air, and that's who they are. And that's right now, that's who they need to be, not only Saturday, but, for eternity.
Well, Purdue certainly has a pretty darn good cornerback under center right now in Aidan O'Connell, and Syracuse head coach Dino Babers had some high praise for O'Connell in the press conference earlier this week. When it comes to O'Connell X's and O's wise, what makes him so difficult to stop for opposing defenses?
He's pretty quick with his release. He has a strong arm. He knows where he wants to go with the ball. And right now that's been going to Charlie Jones a lot. He's not the most mobile guy out there, but he has learned and been taught and worked on moving the pocket a little bit, using whatever athleticism he has. So he's a very good decision maker. He's always been an accurate passer in games. The Penn State game was his worst completion percentage in any game that he's played at Purdue, and that was 50%. He's usually very, very accurate, and he's very decisive on where he wants to go with the ball. And that has been a big strength of him. He's a 6-year guy. He was a walk-on, 9th on the depth chart when he got here, through a series of events with injuries and other things. He's been given a lot of opportunities to play, and he's taken advantage of that. Last year he wasn't named the starter at the beginning of the year. He had to wait until 3, 4, 5 games into the season to be the starter again because things were not going well offensively. Then he just ripped off 6 games of completing 75% or more of his passes. So he came into the year with a lot of momentum, and he's grown into the role. He's kind of a quiet guy, doesn't say a whole lot, but we've seen him grow into the role, and he's very cerebral. He knows what Jeff Brohm wants. He knows the playbook, and he's usually pretty good at executing, what they need in certain situations.
Going from one quarterback to the other, in O'Connell to Garrett Schrader, who you mentioned a couple of minutes ago, he's been really, really good for Syracuse so far this season. We've talked a lot about the Purdue offense and Jeff Brohm, the coaching staff, but what about this Purdue defense? How are they going to look to stop one of the best quarterbacks in the country through the first couple of weeks?
Well, they don't have the star power that they had last year with George Karlaftis on the defensive line. He's now with the Kansas City Chiefs. And then, as I mentioned, they lost Jalen Graham. I think their top defensive player. But what they bring is a lot of depth on the defensive line. They against Penn State, they played 12 defensive linemen. There's not one that is miles ahead of another. They're all kind of the same. But what defensive line coach Mark Hagan has done, especially as you get deeper in the games, is try to get his best 4 out there, regardless of what position they play. They've moved ends inside to tackles to try to get a better pass rush. That's one thing they've been lacking right now. They haven't blitzed a whole lot, and they haven't got a lot of sacks, which is not the determining factor that they use, but they're trying to get pressure on the quarterback, knock him off his spot, make him throw it quicker than he wants to. And that's going to be the whole goal Saturday, is kind of keep him in the pocket because he is a pretty good runner, but also make him as uncomfortable as possible. Easier said than done. Everybody tries to do that. Their secondary, I don't think their cornerbacks have played particularly well the first 2 games, and I think they need to up their game for this week. Linebackers are just guys right now. They're solid. But the one thing they have to do in the absence of Jalen Graham, in running situations, they have to get a little bit bigger, because Jalen is a big guy, can come up to the line of scrimmage and stuff the run, but they're going to have to, be smart and identify running situations to try to get some bigger bodies on the field to help make up for Graham's absence, and also try to slow down the running game.
It's always interesting when an ACC and Big Ten team go toe-to-toe, but for Syracuse, that hasn't really boded all too well. Just 1-7 since 2010 when going up against teams from the Big Ten. I'm curious, from your standpoint, Is there anything that makes that such a tough struggle, whether it's for Syracuse specifically or anyone else, an out-of-conference team going up against a Big Ten team, whether it's Purdue or anyone from the conference? What makes this conference so darn tough for teams outside of it to take care of business against teams that are in it?
Well, I think a lot of it's just about styles, and Purdue style is probably a little unique. They're not a spread offense team, but everybody runs the spread, but they throw it around a lot. But just the Big Ten in general, they recruit well. They get a lot of the best players, not only in the Midwest but across the country, and they're able to stockpile guys and future NFL guys across the board. They're not regulated to just one program. They're spread across all the Big Ten teams, and soon to be spread to UCLA and USC in a couple years. I just think they've had the Big Ten in general has had a high level of talent. I mean, if you just look at the number of draft picks that have come from the Big Ten, the SEC is right there too. So I think there's a lot of factors into it. And it's all about, in a way, this is kind of like a mini bowl game in September where, matchups kind of determine, what happens. Syracuse is not a team Purdue sees every year. I mean, you're going to see them this year and next year. So there's not that you don't know their personnel as well. So you just, in a way, not that they're flying by the seat of their pants, but it just the talent level in the Big Ten has always been pretty good. And I think that overall has been maybe the difference when you get in these interconference matchups that, you need to have guys. You need to have, you win with Jimmys and Joes. And, the Big Ten's had its share of those guys over the years.
Absolutely. So we talked a lot of praise about the Big Ten, but when it comes to going on the road, a noon game in an environment that you don't have a lot of experience playing in, and correct me if I'm wrong, I don't know if there is a dome in the Big Ten, is there?
No, there's not a dome in the Big Ten.
So a new, playing surface, playing arena, whatever you want to call it. What kind of challenges do a noon road game in an unfamiliar environment present for an experienced team like Purdue under an experienced head coach?
Well, it presents a challenge because the noise is more deafening than if you were an outdoor stadium. Purdue's been practicing in its indoor facility all week, and they'll continue to do that. They've cranked up the noise, even though you don't play music at games. It's more fan noise than it is music. But they've worked on their silent counts. They've done probably everything that every other team that goes to Syracuse has done, just trying to combat it. So I mean, it is a challenge because it's different. You don't see it every day. Purdue's played in one dome since Jeff Brohm came here, and that was 2017 at Lucas Oil Stadium. And the program has played in some domes over the years, but this team has not. So I think that's it's something that they just have to prepare for, and they're doing their best to prepare for it. Whether that is the difference in the game, whether Purdue wins, loses, whatever happens, remains to be seen. If they have 10 false starts, then obviously it's going to be a factor. But if they can manage that, and the best thing for them is to take the crowd out of the game, and that's by scoring early, scoring often, and keeping things under control. So that's the best way to combat it. But it is a concern, and it's a factor that I think you have to look at.
All right, Mike, last one we've got for you. What's the biggest thing that you're going to be keying in on come noon Saturday as far as a key to the game if the Boilermakers want to take care of business, and what does Syracuse need to make sure they do in order to walk out with the win? And how do you see things shaping up this weekend?
Well, Purdue's obviously have to contain their two big weapons. They can't let them have big games, and if they do, Syracuse is going to win. I would say whichever stars have the big games, their team is going to win. So they have to keep those guys under check. Syracuse has, as you know, a very big offensive line. They've got, I think, 4 300-pounders at start. So Purdue's got to be able to manage that and to try to get pressure on the quarterback and slow down the running game. I think both teams probably will give up some points. Purdue's not a 3-and-out shutdown defense. They've had stretches where they're good in games, but they're not going to come at you and shut you down. Syracuse is going to score points, and I think Purdue's offense will score points as well. I think from Syracuse standpoint, I would assume they want to take away Charlie Jones, the Purdue top receiver, force O'Connell to go to some other places. I think this is a game where Purdue's tight end, Payne Durham, could be a difference maker. He's been quiet the first 2 games. If Purdue would involve him in the offense a little bit more, or O'Connell would go to him a little bit more, I think that would benefit Purdue big time. But this, as I said, I think this will be a close game. It'll come down to the wire. It'll come down to the fourth quarter, and we'll see what lessons Purdue has learned. And this will be in a way, if it's a close game, be a little bit new experience for Syracuse, because they haven't really been involved this year in a close, tight game. I think their 18 penalties made the first game a little bit closer than they wanted, but and we'll see how all that plays out. But I expect a game that is not determined until close to the end.
Purdue trying to get out to a 2-1 start, winning back-to-back weeks, and Syracuse going for that elusive 3-0 start to the season. That's Mike Carmin of the Lafayette Journal and Courier. Mike, thanks so much for coming on today. Really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
You got it, Mike.